Welcome back to Stab the Dragon Productions, episode number 126. From movie review number 4, as tonight we look at The Vikings, a 1958 epic swashbuckler tale. My wife and I like to watch old movies. And the other 3 movies that I've reviewed are old movies, but I've studied the history of the Viking Age for the past year or so, so this movie fits right in. Now, just the facts. Based on the novel The Viking by Edison Marshall, published in 1951, this movie was produced by Jerry Bresler and Kirk Douglas, directed by Richard Fleischer. Richard Fleischer also directed 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, 1954, Barabbas, 1961, Fantastic Voyage, 1966, which I saw in theater with my dad. All these three movies I loved as a kid. Screenplay was by Calder Willingham. Cinematography by Jack Cardiff, who's a pretty famous cinematographer. The African Queen, 1951, is one of his pieces. Production companies were Brenna Productions, that's Kirk Douglas's production company, and Kurt Lee Production, owned by Tony Curtis and his wife, Janet Lee. Starring Kirk Douglas, and Kirk Douglas was a World War II Navy vet and actually disabled by a depth charge that went off early. He served on a sub chaser and was injured in action. And so he was medically discharged from the Navy during the war because of injuries received. Also, Tony Curtis was a World War II U.S. Navy vet, and he starred in Some Like It Hot, 1959, Spartacus, 1960, and so he served in Spartacus along with Kirk Douglas. And his wife, at the time, Janet Lee, and she played in Psycho, 1960 film with Alfred Hitchcock as the producer, and Bye Bye Birdie, 1963. I think my high school did a musical, Bye Bye Birdie, when I was in high school or junior high. Ernest Borgnine stars in this movie as well. He also was a U.S. Navy vet, and actually he was in the Navy right out of high school in 1935. Served for 10 years, 1935 to 45. So he's also a World War II vet. And he played in From Here to Eternity, 1953, Demetrius and the Gladiators, 1954, and The Dirty Dozen, 1967. So I saw 2 of those movies. The film is narrated by Orson Welles, the great Orson Welles. Music is by Mario Nascimbene, I think is how you say his last name. And the music, by the way, is a very nice moving score that combines nicely with the very beautiful scenery from the cinematography. The scenic views of Norway, the fjords, the ocean, the castle. It's actually in Brittany, France. Now notice, 3 of these actors served in the Navy during World War II, and Kirk Douglas was injured in action. Compare these 3 men of the golden age of Hollywood with the men in Hollywood of today. Now, maybe it's an unfair comparison, but I simply look at those men of that era with great respect. Now, that's my father's era. My father was a World War II vet as well. So, maybe it's an unfair comparison with today, but they accomplished a lot. And yeah, the artistic nature of movies, the technical details have improved over the years, but these were great movies with great actors and actresses. This movie was released in 1958. It had a budget at the time of $3.5 million. It was filmed on site in Norway and Brittany, France. Earned about, and I think part of it was filmed in Germany somewhere too, on a stage in Germany. It earned about $13 million. The running time was 116 minutes, filmed in Technirama. I don't understand those technical details, but needless to say, it was a very well received by the public movie, although the critics didn't like it. Now, what's my rating for this movie? I give it a B plus, and it's a classic movie, B plus. So different movies, different genres of movies, different ages of movie. I'm gonna, have to qualify these scores. So it's a B plus. I enjoyed it. I'm glad I bought it. I'm glad I watched it. But likely will not watch it again. And you can watch it for free on YouTube, I've seen. And the score is available on YouTube for free as well. But I'm glad that I personally own this. I really don't like the whole watching movies online or Netflix or whatever. I prefer to actually uh, have something in hand. So let's give a summary now of the plot. The plot is based on the novel, but also it's very historical. This is a historical novel. It's a historical fiction movie. Revolves around Ragnar. Ragnar, played by Ernest Borgnine, is a real historical figure, as is the King Aella of Northumbria. The history says, or the legend says, that King Aella really did cast Ragnar Lothbrok into a pit, but the pit held deadly serpents, not dogs, and so that's one change in the movie. The rape of the king's wife, which then produced baby Eric, which grows up to be Tony Curtis here, and so he's the half brother of Einar, son of Ragnar, which is Kirk Douglas. Eric is but a slave, and he is unaware of his parentage, as is everybody else. Now let's talk about slavery for a little bit. A lot of people just assume slavery, the American Confederacy, the South, but actually slavery was a worldwide practice for as long as there's been people. The Vikings were slave masters par excellence. The Vikings had slaves. They were engaged in the slave trade from Greenland all the way to the Middle East, Russia, I mean, everywhere in between. So it's coincidence in the movie that the king's wife is raped by Ragnar, and then that baby ends up as a slave in Ragnar's home village, right? And so that's, a major coincidence. Eric is a slave and he's unaware of his royal background. But a Northumbrian trader, Egbert, who goes over to the Vikings, goes over to Ragnar, he recognizes a token that Eric has had since birth. And it's an intricately carved pommel of the sword of his father. And so Egbert recognizes that, and then he puts two and two together, realizes Eric is the bastard child of Ragnar. Eric's father's cousin is Aella, and so there's a relationship. No, that's not quite right. It's not Eric's father's cousin. Well, it's Eric's mother's husband, who Ragnar killed, is the cousin of Aella. So the relationship there's a little bit tricky. But he's now king of Northumbria, and he wants to marry the beautiful Morgana, played by Janet Lee Curtis. But Egbert leads a raid with Einar to Northumbria and takes Morgana and her lady-in-waiting captive back to Norway. So there's a lot of going back and forth between Norway and Northumbria, and that's also historically realistic. And so there, Einar, the son of Ragnar, is about to rape Morgana when the slave, Eric, intervenes and knocks out Einar. Eric then escapes with Morgana back to Northumbria and also manages to capture King Ragnar in the fight in the fog. And the fog scene is actually pretty cool. There's a flight by Eric to escape the Vikings and go to England with Morgana, and there's a fight in the fog on the ocean, and Ragnar ends up on the boat with Eric. So Eric has captured Ragnar, takes him back to England. He presents to King Aella Ragnar, right? And he hopes to gain the thanks from this king and the right to marry Morgana, who's in love with Eric the slave, and yet King Aella himself wants Morgana. So there's actually three guys who want Morgana. There's uh, Eric the slave, there's Einar, son of Ragnar the Viking, and then there's King Aella of Northumbria. They all want Morgana. So this is the classic plot line here. Ragnar is tossed into the pit of hungry dogs and executed. Eric then is denied by the king and has to flee. Eric flees back to Norway and convinces his half-brother Einar to form a raid to attack Northumbria to rescue Morgana. The castle is besieged. Much fighting ensues, and it's cool. There's catapults being used, and arrows and spears and swords and shields, and it's really all quite exciting. Eventually, Eric and Einar have to face off over Morgana. They both love this woman, so, there's got to be a fight. Now, my evaluation of the movie. This is a swashbuckler romance with lots of drinking. Speaking of which, here is an Icelandic Viking beer, Einstock. This is a Baltic porter from Iceland, and it features a Viking there on the front. Now, I don't get any commercial value out of this, but I just thought, a Viking beer, how cool. So this movie, I mean, there's a touch of romance, obviously. You've got three men who want this beautiful woman. Now, there is some graphic scenes here for 1958, right? The most graphic scene is where a hawk rips a man's face and his eye out. That's pretty awesome. A dismemberment scene where somebody loses a hand. Again, that's pretty realistic. But keep in mind, the movie was made in 1958, so the violence is nowhere near as graphic as it would be today. However, the movie was heavily criticized at the time by the critics for all the blood and violence. There's actually very little blood. I mean, the hawk scene is the bloody scene. But for all the sword fighting and stuff, and the guy who loses his hand, I mean, it's not graphic in our modern day standards. But at the time, it was heavily criticized for that. Well, in short, this is exactly the kind of movie that kids in the 1950s, teenagers and adults would love. Think of Leave It to Beaver, Beaver and Wally Cleaver, the TV show. They would love to see this movie. They would talk about this movie. They would go to the Saturday matinee for a movie such as this. The movie is, again, loosely historical fiction, so it's rooted in some history. And actually, they do a solid attempt at showing what Vikings were really like. A couple of the details they got remarkably right. I've studied Viking history for the past year, working on my history project, and this movie just kind of ties right in. Well, Vikings had a particular kind of horse that was smaller, short, stout, kind of a shaggy horse that's different from the horses here in America that we know. So as soon as I saw the horses in Norway, I knew, hey, those are fjord horses, the sturdy mounts of the Vikings. And it looks a little bit, if you're not used to them, I mean, they look a little bit ridiculous, these big Vikings on these shorter horses. But then when you see the scenes in Northumbria, where it's actually filmed in Brittany, France, there were bigger, leaner horses that looked like standard quarter horses of today or Arabian horses. So that was a cool detail they got right in the movie. And another detail that surprised me was that the Vikings were not wearing those ridiculous helmets with the horns, such as you see here on the Einstock beer. Let me hold this up there. The Vikings actually did not wear helmets like that. Those helmets were worn, but they predated the Viking age. Okay. One detail I think they got wrong was that in the big battle scene with the British, the Northumbrians there at the castle, the Northumbrians had some shields that looked like kite shields or heater shields that were actually developed much later than this. This takes place in the 9th century. And those types of shields, I think, were more cavalry shields, but they still look cool. Okay, so I'm not going to quibble over that detail. Well, who should watch this movie? I watched it for two reasons. One, I've been studying the Viking Age, and two, we love to watch old movies. You know, Kirk Douglas, Tony Curtis, Janet Leigh, Ernest Borgnine. I mean, this is greatness here. So I definitely profited by watching this movie. I'm glad I watched it. And if you have a thing for these actors, Kirk Douglas in particular, Tony Curtis, or director Richard Fleischer, very famous director, then this movie is a must see. Now, with a lot of these older movies, as a part of the DVD, there is a movie trailer and some interviews that explain the movie and how it was made. This one has a great interview with director Richard Fleischer that was awesome. He mentioned repeatedly that he and his team had studied the Vikings extensively for the year prior to production because he wanted to get everything right about their culture. They constructed a Viking village in a fjord in Norway. They built Viking ships based off the ships that had been recovered by archaeologists. Even the customs and religion of the Vikings comes through in amazing detail. And one of the subplots in the movie was pagan Viking religion versus the British Christian religion, Roman Catholicism, which ties in with history quite well. That was part of the dynamic of that era. So this religious conflict, I think, is very relevant for today, especially as depicted in the scene where Einar strikes down the priest who is advising Morgana. We're living out, watching live, the resurgent paganism of the modern world, cast down the Christian faith in favor of the wanton sex of paganism. Another aspect of the movie is a good scenic view of our cultural heritage that is also being cast down, abandoned with glee, apparently. We're talking strong Anglo-Saxon heritage here, Scandinavian Viking heritage. These are our literal ancestors, as well as our cultural ancestors. As such, this movie, I think, should be watched today. This movie is full of toxic masculinity that we greatly need more of in this day of the beta male, and those who are confused about their gender. In this movie, men are manly. There are sailing ships, going to war, drinking. There's this one scene of running of the oars when the Vikings come back to their home base, and the oarsmen have their oars out, and the Vikings run across the oars, and some slip and fall in the water. And there's an interesting story about Kirk Douglas, who actually does this. They wanted a stuntman to do it, and Kirk Douglas did it, and he did it better than anybody. That was amazing to watch that, and then to hear that explained by the director later. This is a Homeric epic. I mean, think the Trojan War. It was fought over a woman. Two kings love the same woman, and so they go to war over the woman. That's what's going on here. The two heroes then fight it out for this woman they both want. There's romance, there's war, there's doing hard things, dying well. Oh, that scene. Oh, yeah. We need more of this today. This movie does give me a case of boomer nostalgia. Here you go. As I remember my Leave It to Beaver childhood. Those were the good old days. This movie was roundly panned by the critics of the day, but was very, very successful at the box office for a reason. People like this stuff, not just for its entertainment value, but I think because of the historical nature of it and the subtle truths about our cultural heritage that are portrayed. Well, that does it for this episode of Stab the Dragon. In hoc signo Winkies.